I baked the cake the same way I always did. Same worn mixing bowl. Same chipped wooden spoon. Same quiet moment before sliding it into the oven, when I closed my eyes and let memory guide my hands more than any recipe ever could. I had been making that cake for decades. Birthdays, celebrations, even the quiet Sundays when life needed softening, it had always been there. This one was no different. Or at least I thought it wasn't. Chocolate. Rich, familiar, dependable. Like something that couldn't betray you. I wrapped it carefully once it cooled, the way I always had. Foil first, then a clean cloth. I placed it into my old basket, the one with the slightly crooked handle that still held strong despite the years. It felt right in my hands. It felt like tradition, like belonging. Then my phone lit up. I didn't think much of it at first. Just a message. Just a sound breaking the quiet. But when I read it, something inside me shifted, so suddenly it felt physical. Don't bring anything. We don't eat your food. That was it.
No greeting. No explanation.
No kindness tucked between the words to soften the blow. Just that. I stood there in my kitchen, the cake still warm beneath my fingers, and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not quite anger. Not yet sadness. Recognition. This wasn't about the cake. It had never been about the cake. I read the message again, as if repetition might change it. As if maybe I had misunderstood. But the words didn't soften the second time. Or the third. They stayed exactly as cold as they were written. I didn't need to ask who it was from.
Clara.
She always spoke like that. Clean, sharp, efficient. As if emotions were unnecessary clutter. And Daniel, my son, he never corrected her. He never added warmth where she removed it. He just let her speak for both of them. He had been doing that for years. And I had been allowing it. I set the basket down slowly on the table. The house felt too quiet all of a sudden, like even the walls were listening. Funny how silence changes depending on what fills it. Sometimes it's peaceful. Sometimes it's loud enough to make your chest ache. I sat down and placed my hands on either side of the cake, almost protectively, like it was something alive, like it had been hurt. Maybe it had, or maybe it was just me. I thought about all the times before this one, all the small moments I had dismissed. The way Clara would move things around in my kitchen without asking. The way she would smile politely but never quite warmly. The way my name slowly disappeared from invitations, replaced with family gathering, as if that somehow still included me. I had told myself it wasn't intentional. I had told myself I was imagining it. I had told myself that keeping the peace mattered more. But peace doesn't feel like this. Peace doesn't leave you sitting alone at your own table, wondering if you've become something inconvenient. I looked at the cake again. 38 years of baking for my family. 38 years of showing up with something warm in my hands and love tucked quietly inside it. And now, we don't eat your food. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. I thought about calling someone. Maybe my neighbor. Maybe anyone who would remind me I still existed outside of that message.
But what would I say?
Hi, I made something no one wants. Hi, I think I've been quietly pushed out of my own family.
No.
Some things sound too heavy when spoken out loud. So I stayed where I was. Instead, I cut a slice. The knife moved easily through the cake, still soft in the center. Still perfect. Still mine. I placed it on a plate and sat there, eating slowly, letting the taste settle on my tongue. It was good. It had always been good. That mattered more than I expected. Because if something you've made with love is still good, then maybe the problem was never the thing itself. Maybe it was who refused to see it. I finished the slice in silence. Then I stood up, opened the fridge, and placed the rest of the cake inside. Not thrown away, not hidden, just waiting. Like me, I suppose. I walked back to the table and opened the drawer where I kept old things. Small things. Important things.
Cards.
Every birthday card Daniel had ever given me. I untied the ribbon and spread them out carefully. The older ones were full of handwriting, crooked letters, smudged ink, warmth that didn't need to try so hard. Best mom ever. You make everything better. I love your cake. I smiled faintly at that last one. Of course he did.
He used to.
The newer cards were different. Printed messages. Clean signatures. Short, efficient. Just his name.
No hers.
Never hers. I sat there longer than I expected, tracing the edges of the paper like they might tell me when everything had changed. But the truth is, there's never a single moment. It happens slowly. First, they stop asking your opinion. Then they stop listening. Then one day, they stop needing you at all. And by the time you notice, you're already standing outside something you thought you were still part of. I closed the drawer. Enough. The word came quietly, but it stayed. Enough pretending. Enough shrinking. Enough baking love into things that are never tasted. I reached for my notebook, the one I kept for recipes, reminders, thoughts I didn't say out loud. I opened to a blank page and wrote, "They don't eat my food." Then, after a pause, I added, "But they still expect everything else." I stared at that sentence for a long time, because it was true. Every month, like clockwork, I helped them. Small things. Practical things. Necessary things. School fees. Repairs. Just until next paycheck. And I had never questioned it, because I thought that was love. Giving without asking. Being there without needing acknowledgement.
But now
I wasn't so sure. Maybe love isn't supposed to feel like disappearing. Maybe it isn't supposed to be silent. Maybe it isn't supposed to leave you wondering if you're still allowed to show up. I closed the notebook slowly. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I felt clear. Tomorrow, I thought I would start making changes. Real ones. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just honest. I looked toward the fridge where the cake sat quietly inside. Still warm. Still whole. Still mine. And for the first time that day, that felt like enough. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because something inside me refused to stay still anymore. It wasn't anxiety, not exactly. It felt sharper than that.
clearer.
Like a decision had already been made somewhere deep inside me, and now the rest of me just had to catch up. I stood in front of my closet longer than I needed to. Most days, I reached for whatever was comfortable, something soft, something forgettable. But not today. Today I chose my pale blue blouse, the one I used to wear to important meetings back when people still expected things from me, back when I expected things for myself. It still fit. Maybe a little looser than before, but that didn't matter. What mattered was how it made me feel. Present.
Dressed.
Intentional. I made tea, but I didn't sit down to drink it. I let it cool on the counter as I stood there, looking around my kitchen. It was the same kitchen, same table, same quiet hum of the refrigerator, but it didn't feel the same. It felt like a place I was finally seeing clearly, not through habit, not through memory, but as it was now.
Mine.
That word settled differently today.
Mine.
I picked up my bag, checked that my notebook was inside, and walked out the door without hesitation. The air outside was cool, the kind that wakes you up without asking permission. I welcomed it. I needed that. The walk to the bank wasn't long, but it felt longer than usual, not because of distance, but because of thought. My mind kept circling the same question. How had I let it go on this long? Not just the money, not just the favors, but the quiet assumption that I would always say yes. that I would always be there, that I would always give, even when nothing came back. I didn't have a good answer. Maybe there wasn't one. The bank doors opened automatically, the same way they always did, as if nothing in the world had changed. Inside, everything smelled faintly of air conditioning and polished floors.
Orderly.
Predictable. Controlled. I walked up to the counter and waited my turn. When the young teller called me forward, he smiled the way people often do when they see someone my age, polite, slightly exaggerated, as if kindness needed to be louder to be understood. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" His voice was warm, but distant. Routine. I placed my card on the counter and met his eyes. "I'd like to review my automatic transfers."
That was all I said.
He nodded, still smiling, and began typing. "Of course. Let me pull those up for you." There was a brief silence, filled only by the clicking of his keyboard. Then he looked back at me. "These are the monthly transfers to your son's household, correct?" I nodded once.
Correct.
5 years ago, Daniel had asked for help. "Just temporary," he said. "Just until things stabilized. A new business, unexpected expenses, a rough patch." I didn't hesitate then. Of course I didn't. That's what mothers do, or at least that's what I believed mothers were supposed to do. Temporary had turned into routine. Routine had turned into expectation. And expectation had quietly become entitlement. "They're currently set to continue indefinitely," the teller added. "Would you like to adjust the amount?" I held his gaze a second longer than necessary. "I'd like to stop them." He blinked. Not dramatically, not rudely, just enough to show that wasn't the answer he expected. "Stop them entirely," he clarified. "Yes." There was a pause. A small one. Professional, controlled. "Of course," he said, returning to his keyboard. "I can take care of that for you." I watched his hands move, steady and efficient.
No judgment. No curiosity.
Just action. And something about that felt right. No explanation needed. No justification required. Just a decision being carried out. "It will take effect starting next month," he said after a moment. "That's fine." I didn't feel guilty when I said it. That surprised me more than anything. I had expected hesitation.
Doubt.
Maybe even regret creeping in at the edges. But there was none. Just relief. I thanked him, took my card, and walked out of the bank into the same cool air, but it felt different now. Lighter somehow, as if something invisible had been lifted from my shoulders. I hadn't argued. I hadn't explained. I had simply stopped, and that, I realized, was power. The walk home felt shorter. My steps steadier. The world around me hadn't changed. The same houses, the same trees, the same distant sounds, but I moved through it differently, like I belonged to myself again. When I got home, I didn't rush to sit down. I went straight to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser. Inside was a folder I hadn't touched in a while. I knew exactly where it was. I had always known. Daniel. It was labeled neatly on the tab. Inside were years of records, bank statements, copies of checks, notes I had written to myself when something didn't feel right, but I couldn't quite explain why. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Page after page. Amounts.
Dates.
Reasons. School expenses.
Repairs.
Just this once. Short on cash. "Can you help?" I had never said no. Not once. I took a pen from the nightstand and added a new note at the top. March 19th. Canceled all monthly transfers. No discussion. I paused, then added.
No guilt.
That part mattered. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer, but not as deeply as before. Not hidden. Not buried. Just stored. There's a difference. Back in the kitchen, my tea was cold. I poured it out and made a fresh cup. This time, I sat down by the window. Outside, the neighborhood moved as it always did. People walking.
Cars passing.
Life continuing without asking permission. I watched it quietly, letting the stillness settle around me. Not the heavy silence from yesterday, but something else.
Choice.
Around noon, my phone buzzed. I didn't reach for it right away. I let it sit there, vibrating softly against the table, as if testing whether I would respond on instinct the way I always had. Eventually, I picked it up. Daniel. Of course. Hey, Mom. Did something happen with the bank? Got a notification. No greeting beyond that. No, how are you? Just the problem. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I set the phone back down. I didn't reply. At 12:27, it buzzed again. Clara. Calling. I watched the screen light up with her name, bright and insistent. I let it ring, all the way through. Then I turned the phone over. Silence returned, but this time, it didn't feel like something being taken from me. It felt like something I was choosing. And that changed everything. I stood up, walked to the fridge, and took out the cake from yesterday. I cut another slice, slower this time, more deliberate. I placed it on a plate, sat down, and took a bite. Still soft, still rich, still mine. I smiled slightly. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It wasn't about being accepted. It was about recognizing what had always been true. I had spent years giving without question. Now I was finally allowing myself to choose. And that, I realized as I sat there in my quiet kitchen, wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The silence didn't disappear the next day. It stayed, but it changed shape. Before, it used to feel like something pressing against me, something heavy and expectant, like I was always waiting for it to break, waiting for a call, a message, a reason to respond. Now it felt different. It wasn't pressing anymore. It was settling, like dust finally allowed to fall where it may instead of constantly being stirred. I didn't check my phone when I woke up. That alone felt unfamiliar enough to make me pause. For years, I had started my mornings by reaching for it just in case someone needed something, just in case there was a message I shouldn't ignore. But that morning, I left it where it was, face down on the kitchen counter, as I moved through my routine without it. I made oatmeal. Simple, warm, nothing special. I carried the bowl out to the back porch and sat wrapped in my shawl, watching the sky stretch slowly into morning. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and something sweet from a nearby garden. It reminded me of a time when mornings weren't about obligation, but about beginning. I ate slowly, not because I had nowhere to go, but because I finally wasn't rushing toward anything. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. After breakfast, I went back inside and stood in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do next. Not because there was nothing to do, there was always something, but because for the first time in years, none of it felt urgent. No one was waiting. No one was expecting. No one was silently relying on me to fill a gap they refused to acknowledge. It was unsettling and freeing. I walked down the hallway to the spare room and opened the cedar chest I hadn't touched in years. The lid creaked slightly, the sound familiar and almost comforting. Inside were pieces of my life that had been set aside, not because they didn't matter, but because there had always been something more immediate demanding my attention. Now there wasn't. I lifted things out one by one. Old fabrics, photographs, small objects that carried weight far beyond their size. I found Daniel's baby blanket, soft and worn at the edges, and ran my fingers over it, remembering a version of him that had needed me without condition. I found my husband's cufflinks, still polished despite the years, and held them a moment longer than necessary before placing them aside. Then I found the quilt. I had started it years ago, during a time when my life had narrowed down to doctor visits and quiet endurance. Each square had been stitched slowly, deliberately, as if I was holding myself together through the act of making something whole. When I got better, I stopped working on it. I told myself I didn't need it anymore. But looking at it now, I realized that wasn't true. It had never been about illness. It had been about survival. I carried the quilt downstairs and spread it across the table. The fabric was uneven in places, some stitches tighter than others, but it was honest. Nothing about it was hidden or perfected for appearance. It simply was what it was. Like me. I sat down and ran my hand across it, feeling the texture of time beneath my fingertips. There were pieces from old dresses, from curtains, from aprons I had worn in kitchens filled with voices that no longer came. Each square held a moment, a memory, a version of myself that had existed without needing permission. I stayed there for a long time, not thinking, just remembering. Around midday, there was a knock at the door. I knew who it was before I opened it. Mrs. Carter, my neighbor, stood there holding a small tin, her expression gentle but observant in a way that told me she had noticed more than I had said. "You've been quiet," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I smiled faintly. "I think I've been listening." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. She never did. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. She understood that not everything needed to be explained to be understood. We sat together on the porch, sharing the cookies she had brought. She talked about her daughter visiting, about plans for the spring, about small things that filled the space without demanding anything from me. I told her, eventually, about the bank. Not in detail, just enough. "I stopped helping them financially," I said simply. She nodded, as if I had told her something long overdue. "Took you long enough," she replied, not unkindly. I let out a small laugh. "Yes," I said. "It did." We didn't dwell on it. We didn't analyze it. The moment didn't need that. It was enough to say it out loud and have it land somewhere safe. After she left, the house felt different again, not empty, not full, just mine. I went back to the table and picked up my notebook. Instead of writing numbers or reminders, I started a different kind of list. Things that still belonged to me. My home.
My time.
My choices.
My voice.
My memories. I paused, then added, my silence. That one mattered more than the others, because silence, I realized, wasn't always absence. Sometimes it was presence. Sometimes it was the refusal to fill space just because someone else expected you to. I closed the notebook and set it aside. The afternoon passed quietly. I moved through small tasks, washing dishes, folding laundry, opening windows to let fresh air in. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic, but everything felt deliberate, chosen. That evening, I finally picked up my phone. There were messages. Several from Daniel. 2 missed calls from Clara. A voicemail. I didn't listen to it. Not right away. Instead, I placed the phone back down and went to the kitchen. I made tea again the same way I always did, but this time I paid attention to every step. The sound of the kettle, the warmth of the cup in my hands, the way the steam rose and disappeared into the air. Simple things. Grounding things. Only after I sat down did I pick up the phone again. I opened the messages. "Mom, did you cancel the transfers? Can you call me? This is kind of urgent." The last one came from Clara. "I think we need to talk." I stared at that message for a long moment.
Need.
It was an interesting word. For years, their needs had come before everything else. Immediate. Important.
Non negoziable.
And now I had a choice. I locked the phone without replying. Not out of spite. Not out of anger. But because I wasn't ready to respond. And for the first time, that felt like a valid reason. I didn't owe immediacy anymore. I didn't owe availability. I didn't owe access. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It answered back. It told me something I had ignored for too long, that I was allowed to exist without constantly being in service to someone else's expectations. That night, I returned to the quilt. I threaded a needle slowly, carefully, and chose a new piece of fabric to add. It was from an old apron, one I had worn countless times while baking for people who had barely noticed. I smiled slightly at the thought. Then I stitched it in. Not rushed, not perfect, but intentional. Each stitch felt like a small act of reclaiming something I hadn't realized I had given away.
Time.
Attention. Self. When I finally went to bed, I felt tired, but not drained. There was a difference. One comes from being used. The other comes from being alive. I lay there in the quiet, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling around me, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I felt like something already had, and whatever came next would be on my terms. By the fourth day, the silence had settled so naturally into my life that I stopped noticing it as something unusual. It no longer followed me from room to room like a question waiting to be answered. It became part of the rhythm of the house, the same way the ticking clock or the hum of the refrigerator had always been there, quietly present, asking nothing from me. I didn't check my phone that morning either. I had stopped expecting anything from it, and in return, it stopped having power over me. That alone felt like a kind of freedom I hadn't known I was missing. I spent the morning in the kitchen, not baking out of habit, but because I wanted to. There's a difference between doing something because it's expected and doing it because it still belongs to you. I chose something simple, scones. Not for anyone else, not for a visit, not for a celebration. Just for myself. The process was slower than usual, but not because I was tired. I was paying attention. The texture of the dough, the smell of butter, the quiet anticipation while they baked. I realized I had spent years rushing through moments that were meant to be lived in. When they were done, I didn't rush to taste them. I let them cool on the tray, watching the steam rise and disappear. There was something peaceful about not needing to prove anything, not even to myself. Around midday, I finally turned my phone on. It lit up immediately. Missed calls, messages, voicemails. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the table and poured myself tea. I sat by the window and let the light fall across the floor, watching how it shifted slowly, quietly, without asking permission from anyone. That's when the knock came. 3 short knocks. Then a pause. Then one more. I froze for a second. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. That pattern wasn't random. It was familiar in a way that pulled something from deep inside my memory before I could even place it. I stood up slowly and walked to the door. When I opened it, Daniel was standing there, alone. That was the first thing I noticed.
No Clara. No explanación. No preparación.
Just him. He looked different. Not physically, not in a way I could immediately point to. But there was something unsettled in the way he stood, like he wasn't entirely sure he should be there.
Mom, he said.
I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him, taking in the details I had stopped noticing over the years, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided mine for a fraction of a second before returning, the way he shifted his weight like he used to when he was younger and knew he had done something wrong but didn't yet know how to say it. "Can I come in?" he asked. That question alone told me more than anything else. He used to walk in without asking. I stepped aside. He entered slowly, looking around as if the house might have changed in his absence. But it hadn't. Not physically. Everything was where it had always been. The difference wasn't in the space.
It was in me.
He sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped loosely, the way he used to sit when he was a teenager waiting for a difficult conversation to begin. I didn't sit immediately. I remained standing for a moment, watching him, letting the silence stretch just enough to remind him that this wasn't going to be the same kind of interaction we had always had. "I got your message," he said finally. "I didn't send one," I replied. He blinked, then gave a small, awkward nod. "I meaned about the bank." "Of course. Not, 'How are you?' Not, 'I was worried.' Just that." I walked over and sat across from him, leaving space between us. "Yes," I said. I stopped the transfers. There it was. Simple.
Clear.
No apology attached. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, but I could see the confusion behind his eyes. Not outrage. Not even anger. Just disorientation. As if something he had always relied on had suddenly shifted, and he didn't yet know how to adjust. "I just wanted to make sure everything's okay," he said. "Everything's okay." I almost smiled at that. "I'm fine," I said. He hesitated. It's a bit sudden."
No, y replica calmly.
"It's just the first time I've acted on it." That landed. I saw it in the way his posture changed slightly, like something had clicked into place that he hadn't considered before. He looked down at his hands. "Clara didn't mean anything by that message," he said. "She's just particular." "About food?" I asked. He didn't answer. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of things that had been left unsaid for years. "I was going to bring the cake," I continued, my voice steady. "The same one I've made every year. The same one you used to love." He swallowed. "It wasn't about the cake," I added. He nodded slowly. "I know, but you didn't say anything." That was the part that mattered. Not what Clara said. What he didn't. He exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "Things have been complicated." I tilted my head slightly. "And I'm the complication?" "No," he said quickly. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He didn't have an answer. And that, more than anything, told me the truth. For years, I had filled in those gaps for him. I had softened his silence, explained his absence, justified his inaction. I wasn't doing that anymore. "I'm not angry," I said after a moment. "I'm just done pretending that this is normal." He looked up at me then, really looked, as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. "Are you cutting us off?" he asked carefully. "I'm changing the terms," I replied. That was the most accurate way to say it. Because this wasn't about punishment. It was about balance. He leaned back slightly, processing that. Silence again, but different. He stood after a moment, unsure, like he didn't know whether the conversation was over or just paused. "I'll talk to Clara," he said. "You should," I replied. "And maybe we can figure this out." I didn't respond immediately. Not because I didn't hear him, but because I wasn't ready to offer reassurance where none had been earned. "I'll think about it," I said finally. That was all I gave him. He nodded, accepting it, though I could tell it wasn't what he expected. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a brief second, as if considering something more, an apology, maybe, or something close to it. But whatever it was, he didn't say it. He just left. And the door closed quietly behind him. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence return. But it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like space. Space that no longer belonged to someone else's expectations. Space that was finally mine. I walked back into the kitchen and looked at the scones still sitting on the tray. I took one, broke it in half, and sat down at the table. The house was still. But not heavy. Not anymore. I took a bite and let myself sit with everything that had just happened, not analyzing it, not questioning it, just letting it exist. Because for the first time in a long time, I hadn't tried to fix anything. I hadn't explained. I hadn't softened. I had simply told the truth. And that, I realized as I sat there in my quiet kitchen, wasn't something I needed to take back. After Daniel left, I didn't follow him to the door the way I used to. I didn't stand there watching his car disappear down the street, holding on to that quiet hope that maybe next time would be different. I simply returned to the kitchen, rinsed my cup, and dried it slowly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. Not in the way he might have expected. No dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, but in a quieter, more permanent way. Something had shifted, and it wasn't going back. That evening, I opened the drawer again, the one with the folder. For years, I had treated it like something temporary, something I kept just in case, without ever defining what that case might be. But now I understood. I hadn't been collecting papers. I had been collecting clarity. I carried the folder to the table and spread everything out carefully. Not hurried, not emotional, methodical. Page by page. Year by year. Numbers have a way of telling the truth when people don't. I took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote at the top, financial record, family support. Then I started listing. Not estimates. Not guesses.
Facts.
March 2016, $2,500. Business startup help. December 2016, $600. Emergency plumbing. April 2017, $150. School supplies. August 2018, $1,200. Car repair. November 2019, $300. Groceries. February 2020, $500. Birthday surprise for Clara. June 2021, $700. Short-term loan. September 2022, $650. Monthly support begins. And on it went, line after line, year after year. By the time I finished, the total sat quietly at the bottom of the page. $10,840. I stared at the number for a long time, not because it shocked me, because it didn't. That was the part that stayed with me. I would have given twice that amount without hesitation, if it had felt like love. But it hadn't. It had felt expected.
Routine.
Invisible. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. This wasn't about money. It had never been about money. It was about being reduced to something useful, and then eventually something replaceable. I folded the paper neatly and placed it on top of the stack. Not hidden, not tucked away. Visible, because I wasn't hiding from it anymore. That night, I didn't turn my phone on. I didn't need to. If something truly mattered, it could wait, or it could come to my door, like he had. The next morning, I made a decision that felt just as important as the one at the bank. I called my lawyer. It had been years since I last spoke to him. Back then, it was about practical things, documents, signatures, arrangements that felt distant and abstract. Things you prepare for, but don't expect to need anytime soon. But time has a way of changing what feels distant. Victoria, it's been a while, he said when he answered, his voice warm but professional. Yes, I replied, but I need to make some changes. There was a brief pause. What kind of changes? I didn't hesitate. I want to update my will. That sentence landed differently than I expected. Not heavy, not frightening, just necessary. Of course, he said. Do you want to come in this week? Yes, I replied. As soon as possible. We scheduled it for Thursday. After the call ended, I sat there for a moment, holding the phone in my hand. I wasn't acting out of anger. That was important. I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. And those two things are not the same. The rest of the day passed quietly, but not idly. I moved with purpose, even in small things. I cleaned out drawers I had ignored for years. I sorted through papers, old notes, forgotten receipts. Not because I needed to clear space in the house, but because I needed to clear space in my life. There's something powerful about choosing what stays and what doesn't. In the afternoon, I found a small envelope tucked between two books on a shelf I rarely touched. Inside were old notes Daniel had written when he was younger. Short, simple things. Thanks for helping me. You make the best food. Love you, Mom. I sat there holding them, feeling something soften. Not enough to undo anything, not enough to blur what had happened, but enough to remind me of something important. People don't become strangers overnight. They change slowly. And sometimes they forget who they used to be. But that doesn't mean I have to forget who I am. I placed the notes back carefully, not as proof of anything, just as memory. That evening, I finally turned my phone on. Messages flooded in again. More from Daniel. One from Clara. We need to talk about what you're doing. I read it once. Then I locked the screen.
No urgency.
No reaction. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly. I wasn't doing something to them. I was doing something for myself. And those are not the same thing, no matter how they choose to see it. The next morning, I prepared for my appointment. I chose my clothes carefully again. Not to impress anyone, not to present anything, but because I wanted to feel aligned with what I was about to do. There's a quiet dignity in showing up for your own decisions. When I arrived at the office, everything was exactly as I remembered. The same hallway, the same muted colors, the same quiet professionalism that made everything feel orderly, contained, predictable, unlike life. My lawyer greeted me with a firm handshake and a respectful nod. "What would you like to change?" he asked once we sat down. I took a breath. Then I said it. I want to remove Daniel and Clara from my will. He didn't react immediately.
No surprise. No judgment.
Just attention. "And who would you like to leave everything to?" he asked. "My grandson," I said. "All of it." The words felt steady.
Right.
He nodded slowly and began writing. There was a pause, the kind that invites explanation but doesn't demand it. I didn't plan to say anything more, but I did. "They've forgotten I'm a person," I said quietly. "Not a resource, not an obligation, just a person." He looked up, met my eyes, and nodded once. Understood. That was enough. No long speech.
No justification.
Just recognition. I signed the documents when they were ready. My hand didn't shake. Not even slightly. Each signature felt like a line being drawn, not between me and them, but between who I had been and who I was choosing to be now. When it was done, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief. Not satisfaction.
Clarity.
Clean and sharp. Like a window that had finally been wiped clear after years of dust. When I got home, I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I made soup. Simple, warm, enough for one. I sat at the table and ate slowly, not thinking about what I had just done, but about what it meant moving forward. Because this wasn't an ending. It was a correction. A realignment. And maybe, just maybe, a beginning I should have allowed myself a long time ago. The house felt different after I changed the will. Not louder, not fuller, but steadier, like something inside its walls had finally aligned with the truth I had been avoiding for years. I didn't rush to tell anyone. I didn't feel the need to explain or justify it. That decision wasn't made for them, it was made for me. And for the first time in a long while, that distinction mattered. The next morning, I found myself standing by the window, holding an old photograph. It was small, slightly faded, the kind that carries more feeling than detail. In it, a little boy stood at my kitchen counter, covered in flour, his hands lifted midair as if he had just discovered something magical in the mixing bowl. His eyebrows were raised in surprise, his smile uneven and completely unfiltered. On the back, in my own handwriting, I had written, "First cookies together." I didn't need to check the date. I knew exactly who it was.
Ethan.
My grandson. I hadn't realized how much I missed that version of him. The one who didn't ask permission to be close, who didn't measure his words, who didn't carry the quiet distance that adults learn to wear like armor. He had always been different. Even when the rest of the house grew louder, colder, more structured, he noticed things. Small things. The way I set the table. The way I paused before adding sugar. The way I smiled when something turned out just right.
He had always seen me.
And maybe that was why I couldn't ignore everything else anymore. I set the photo down carefully and pulled out the old cookbook, the one he used to insist we use even when I told him we didn't need it. He liked turning the pages, liked pretending recipes were secrets instead of habits. I opened it slowly, flipping through the worn pages, each one carrying small marks of time, smudges of flour, notes in the margins, tiny adjustments written in pencil. It wasn't just a book. It was a record of moments.
Of us.
I sat down at the table and took out a sheet of paper. Not my notebook this time. Something different. Something meant to be read by someone else. I began to write. Not quickly. Not carefully either. Just honestly. I wrote about the Tuesdays we used to have together. The afternoons when I would pick him up from school and we would come back here to this kitchen and bake something simple. Banana muffins. Sugar cookies. Things that didn't need perfection, just attention. I wrote about how he used to stand on that old chair to reach the counter, how he never followed the recipe exactly, how he always added something extra, cinnamon, vanilla, sometimes too much of both. I wrote about how those moments had stayed with me, even when everything else had started to change. And then I wrote the part one hadn't said out loud. You didn't just eat what I made. You made it with me. That matters more than you think. I paused after that, staring at the words, because they were true, more true than anything I had said in years. I folded the letter and placed it inside the cookbook, between two pages I knew he would find eventually. Not hidden, not obvious, just waiting. The way some things are meant to be found. Later that afternoon, I walked to the post office. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to move. There's something grounding about walking somewhere with purpose, even a small one. The air was cool again, the kind that brushes against your skin without asking, reminding you that you're still part of the world outside your own thoughts. When I returned home, there was a missed call, Daniel, and a voicemail.
I listened this time.
Mom, look, I don't know what's going on, but Clara's really upset. She feels like you're punishing us. Maybe we can just sit down, talk about it, clear things up. His voice sounded tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just uncertain. I sat there for a moment after it ended. Then I deleted it. Not because I didn't hear him, but because I wasn't going to return to conversations that began with misunderstanding and ended with me explaining myself into exhaustion. That chapter was closed. Or at least paused. Around 6 in the evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked to the door slowly, not rushing, not anticipating. When I opened it, Ethan stood there, taller than I remembered. Older, of course, but still him. "Hi," he said, shifting his weight slightly, as if unsure whether he should be there. I felt something soften immediately.
I raplia, stepping asida. Come in.
He entered quietly, looking around in that familiar way, taking in details without making it obvious. The same habit he had as a child. I was nearby, he said. Thought I'd stop by.
You don't need a reason, I said. He smiled faintly at that.
We moved into the kitchen without discussing it. Some habits don't need explanation. I poured tea. He didn't ask for anything, but his eyes landed on the counter.
The cake.
A different one this time.
Carrot.
I remember this one, he said. Of course you do, I replied. I cut him a slice without asking. He took a bite and paused, the way people do when something familiar meets them again after a long time. You still make it the same, he said. I never changed it. He nodded slowly, as if that meant more than the words themselves. We sat there in a comfortable quiet, not forced, not filled, just shared. I found your letter, he said after a while, pulling it from his jacket. That was fast, I replied. He smiled slightly. I know the post office clerk. I laughed. That felt good. I didn't know about the party, he added, his voice quieter now. About the message. I know, I said. He looked up at me then, direct, honest. If I had known, you would have come anyway, I finished for him. He nodded. Yes. That was enough. No explanation needed, because with him I didn't need to guess. I didn't need to fill in silence. He spoke for himself. We talked for a while after that, about small things.
School, books,
A class he was struggling with,
a teacher he liked.
Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, but everything real. When he stood to leave, he hesitated for just a second. Can I come back next week? He asked. That question stayed with me.
Because he didn't need to ask.
But he did. Yes, I said. Anytime. He nodded, then hugged me. Not quickly, not lightly, the way he used to. When he left, I didn't feel the silence return, because something had replaced it. Not noise, not distraction, connection. Real, quiet, steady connection. I went back to the kitchen and sat down, looking at the empty plate where his cake had been. I didn't feel erased anymore, not even a little, because being unseen by some people doesn't make you invisible. It just means they stopped looking. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who still does. A week passed, then another, and I stopped measuring time by whether or not my phone rang. That used to be my quiet habit, waiting without admitting I was waiting, listening for something that might prove I still mattered in someone else's world. But now, time moved differently. It moved through my hands, through small decisions, through ordinary moments that no longer felt like something to pass through, but something to live inside. The house had changed, though nothing inside it had moved. The furniture stood where it always had. The kitchen still smelled faintly of sugar and tea. The clock still ticked with the same steady rhythm, but the weight was gone. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like a fog lifting until you suddenly realize you can see clearly again. I wasn't filling space for anyone anymore. I wasn't adjusting myself to fit into conversations I wasn't invited into. I was simply here. Ethan came every Thursday. Not always at the same time, not always with a plan, but always with intention. Sometimes he brought coffee, sometimes nothing at all. Once he showed up with a notebook and asked me to teach him how to make bread properly, not just by following instructions, but by understanding it. You always say you can feel when it's ready, he said. I want to know what that means. And I showed him, not by explaining everything, but by letting him try, by letting him fail a little, by letting him stay in the process long enough to understand that some things can't be rushed or simplified. We didn't talk about his parents much. Not because it was forbidden, but because it wasn't necessary. He knew what had happened. I knew he knew. And that was enough. There was a quiet agreement between us. something unspoken but strong, that we wouldn't turn our time into something heavy. We would keep it honest, but we would also keep it ours. Daniel texted occasionally, short messages, careful ones, updates more than conversations. Fix the garage light. Work's been busy. Hope you're doing okay. I didn't ignore them, but I didn't rush to answer either. Sometimes I replied with a simple good or glad to hear it. Sometimes I didn't reply at all, not to punish him, not to create distance, just because I didn't feel the need to fill every silence anymore. Clara never reached out. At first, I noticed that absence. Then I stopped. There's a difference between someone being quiet and someone choosing not to exist in your space at all. And once you understand that difference, you stop waiting for things that were never meant to arrive. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the hallway mirror. I hadn't looked at myself properly in a long time. Not out of avoidance, but out of habit. You stop noticing yourself when your attention is always directed outward. But this time I looked, not critically, not carefully, just honestly. I saw the lines on my face, the softness where time had settled, the slight tilt of my shoulders. But I also saw something I hadn't expected, recognition, not of who I used to be, but of who I still was. Someone steady, someone capable, someone who had spent years giving and finally understood that giving without being seen is not the same as being loved. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me clear. I turned away from the mirror and walked back into the kitchen. The light was softer that day, filtered through thin clouds, resting gently on the table. I placed my hands on the surface, feeling the worn wood beneath my fingertips. This table had held everything: meals, arguments, laughter, silence. And through all of it, I had remained. That mattered more than anything else. Later that evening, there was a knock at the door. Not Ethan. Not my neighbor. Daniel. I saw him through the window before I opened the door. He stood there without anything in his hands. No flowers, no offering, no reason to soften his presence. Just himself. When I opened the door, he looked at me differently than he had before. Not with expectation. Not with assumption. With awareness.
Hi, he said. I rablia.
He didn't ask to come in immediately this time. He waited. That, too, was new. You can come in, I said after a moment. He stepped inside slowly, as if the space required more respect than it used to. We didn't go to the living room. We went to the kitchen. Of course we did. He stood near the table, running his hand lightly over the surface, as if remembering something he hadn't allowed himself to notice in years. I miss this, he said quietly. I know, I replied. We stood there in silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just honest. I've been thinking, he continued, about everything. I didn't interrupt. I think I got used to not seeing things clearly, he said. It was easier. Yes, I said. It usually is. He nodded. I didn't realize how much I stopped showing up, he added. That's the thing about stopping slowly, I said. You don't notice it until you're already gone. He looked down at the table, then back at me. I'm sorry, he said. This time, I didn't rush to accept it. I didn't dismiss it either. I let it sit there. Because apologies, like everything else, need space to be real. Then show me, I said finally. He nodded. I will. We didn't solve everything that night. We didn't need to. Some things aren't fixed in a single conversation. Some things are rebuilt through consistency, through presence, through choosing differently, again and again. Before he left, he paused at the door. Can I come by again? He asked. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, if you come as yourself, yes. He understood what that meant. After he left, I didn't stand at the door. I went back to the kitchen. I took out a small jar of jam I had made earlier that week, apricot, sweet and slightly sharp, and placed it on the table. Next to it, I set 2 cups, not because I expected anyone, but because I was no longer afraid of the possibility. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something I had been missing for a long time.
Choice.
I sat down, poured tea into 1 cup, and took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle into me. This was my life. Not the version shaped by expectation. Not the version defined by someone else's comfort, but the one I chose to keep. And for the first time, that was more than enough.